So today there's a trust model that exists with the verifier community in credentials that come from the legitimate issuing authority from the jurisdictions in the US and Canada. So this trust model is less of the verifier knowing exactly what each jurisdiction's process is and making a decision based off of that, and more just having trust in knowing that the product came from a reliable issuing authority and having trust that they have good processes in place. The documents from the issuing authorities are generally accepted, even with little education or tools to be able to determine a genuine from a non-genuine certificate. So depending, of course, on what the risk is for the verifier party, and more often than not, whatever credential or documents accepted to the verifier is generally accepted as a proof of ID for that individual. Their confidence still exists, albeit the thousands of counterfeits that are in rotation daily that are being used for several different people for several different reasons. Again, the verifier community or the relying parties still have huge confidence in the products that are presented to them that they use as far as identity for their services. And that is just the reality of the situation. So it's not a perfect system. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, but it is what we have today. And for the most part, obviously, does seem to be working. So how do we strengthen this? In 2008, the Department of Homeland Security issued the Real ID Act, which establishes minimum standards for driver licenses and ID cards that will be used for federal purposes. Many jurisdictions are, in fact, have implemented Real ID solutions in their states, but DHS has pushed out their compliance date for when these cards need to be accepted through 2021 as a result of the pandemic. The Real ID Act basically, in the requirements or the standards it's established, has rules around the documents that can be accepted as a proofing and vetting process prior to the Real ID being issued, and some of those standard issuance processes as far as like when the photo needs to be taken, those types of things. There are, of course, documents that each jurisdiction may issue that's not a Real ID document, and the Real ID standards, of course, don't apply to those documents. These documents are still being used in a lot of non-federal cases as proof of identity with the verifier community today and are accepted. But having said that, the Real ID standards have significantly improved the landscape for the proofing and vetting processes for jurisdictions and helping to strengthen that trust between the verifier community and the issuing authorities. So what is the vision for mobile driver license? So we envision somewhat of the same thing. What we'd like to see is that trust I talked about before being maintained from the verifier community to the issuing authorities. So again, without the issuing authorities knowing exactly what the jurisdiction or the issuing authorities processes for how they provisioned and what documents they accepted, those types of things, to be able to know that the MDL coming from the jurisdiction is trustable because it's coming from the jurisdiction. So that trust framework and that confidence in the issuing authority should not change with the move to mobile. There are, of course, going to be vulnerabilities, just like we talked about with the physical credentials. There's a potential for counterfeit products and for fakes to come across your table. But with the mobile driver license solution, we are looking at a better solution, more likely than the physical credentials. So we're definitely no worse off than we are today. If anything, we have a better design and mechanism in place, which Lofi will talk about a little bit more as we move forward. But we're definitely no worse off than we are today, and we're building a stronger, better solution for the products that will be provided to the issuing authorities for use for ID. And just like with the physical credentials, there are standards. The Real ID standards, of course, are being trying to be updated to be able to incorporate mobile driver licenses used for Real ID. There's also standards that have been developed that are close to being cooked with the ISO groups that I'll get into a little bit later in this presentation, I think, with you, that really helps out the ground rules for the interoperability and, again, helping to establish the trust model for the mobile driver licenses.